Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
The chill of the old hospital basement was something I'd grown used to over the years. Working as a coroner in an understaffed rural town wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work, and the quiet suited me. My name's Owen, and I've spent a decade among the dead, documenting their stories through scalpel and report. If you do this job long enough, death becomes routine, a puzzle to solve, not something to fear, or so I thought. It started on an overcast Wednesday, just past midnight. A call came in about an unidentified woman found near the edge of the lake. The sheriff, a man named Amos with tired eyes and a heavy limp, delivered the body himself. "Good luck, kid," he muttered as he handed me the paperwork. His tone wasn't ominous, just weary, but it lingered with me. Amos rarely spoke in riddles. The woman was young, mid-20s I guessed, and strikingly beautiful, even in death. Her auburn hair framed her face like a painting, her skin pale but unblemished. She could have been asleep. According to the report, there were no visible injuries. Drowning, maybe, a toxic reaction. I wouldn't know until I began the autopsy. Unzipping the body bag felt oddly intrusive, like I was peeling back a layer of privacy she hadn't consented to share. Her hands were folded neatly, and there was something unsettling about their stillness, as though they held secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. The room was cold, colder than usual, but I dismissed the thought. It was always cold here. The initial examination was straightforward. No bruising, no broken bones. Her organs appeared normal, though her heart showed faint signs of discoloration, a detail I jotted down absently. That's when I noticed it, a single tear trailing from the corner of her eye. I leaned closer. Was it condensation? No, the liquid had the unmistakable sheen of salt water. Strange, her pupils too were dilated, as though she'd seen something in her final moments that defied explanation. As I turned her over to examine her back, I felt a faint vibration beneath my gloves. A twitch. Post-mortem spasm, I told myself. It happens. But when I rolled her back, her body seemed warmer than before. Impossible. The refrigeration units ensured a constant icy temperature. I stepped back, rubbing the back of my neck, suddenly aware of how quiet the room had become. The hum of the overhead lights felt distant, muted. I decided to take a break, stepping into the hallway for air. The hospital basement had no windows, just concrete walls and fluorescent lights that hummed faintly, like an uneasy lullaby. I'd been working long hours, and fatigue could explain the oddities. Still, something gnawed at the edges of my mind, a feeling I couldn't shake. When I returned, I froze in the doorway. The woman's right arm, which I'd left resting at her side, was now draped across her chest. My stomach dropped. I scanned the room, half expecting someone to step out from the shadows, laughing at the elaborate prank. But there was no one, just me and her. Swallowing hard, I repositioned the arm and continued my work. As I sutured the chest incision, I felt a faint movement beneath my fingers. Not a spasm this time. This was deliberate, reactive. Her skin, once cold, now seemed to pulse with a faint warmth as though life was seeping back into her. I told myself it was an illusion, my overworked brain playing tricks. And then her eyelids twitched. I froze. The next few seconds stretched into eternity. Slowly, impossibly, her eyes opened. They locked onto mine with a clarity that shouldn't have been possible. My breath hitched, my hands trembling. Her chest rose sharply as she gasped, the sound echoing like a scream in the silence. She sat up suddenly, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette learning its strings. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice raspy and strained. Her gaze darted around the room, wide and terrified. I couldn't answer. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. Her hands clutched at her throat as though remembering something terrible. That's when I noticed them. Thin, purple lines circling her neck in intricate patterns. They weren't bruises. They looked deliberate, almost ceremonial. Her fingers traced them absent-mindedly before she locked eyes with me again. "Help me," she pleaded, her voice cracking. I grabbed a blanket and draped it over her trembling shoulders, my hands shaking as I tried to steady her. She flinched at my touch, her entire body recoiling as though the blanket itself was searing her skin. Her face twisted in pain, and then, suddenly, she screamed. A raw, guttural sound that pierced the room and made my blood run cold. The surgical trays rattled, instruments clattering to the floor. She stumbled off the table, her legs buckling beneath her. As I rushed to catch her, she spun toward me, her glassy eyes filled with something unnameable. A fury, a sadness, a despair too vast to comprehend. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no sound came. Instead, she collapsed into my arms, her body limp and lifeless. This time there was no pulse, no faint warmth, just the cold, unyielding weight of death. When the sheriff returned the next morning, I handed him the completed report, my face carefully blank. "Nothing unusual," I said when he asked about the night. I couldn't bring myself to tell him. How could I? No one would believe it. But I know what I saw. And every night since, I've felt her presence lingering just beyond the edge of the shadows. Sometimes I hear her voice, a faint, desperate whisper, "Help me." And I know, deep down, that this isn't over. Death might have taken her, but it hasn't let her go. And now, it watches me too, waiting for the moment when it will drag me into its cold, merciless embrace. My name is Javier Ortega, and I've been a coroner for over a decade. In that time, I've encountered the kind of things that would make most people shudder and turn away. I thought I'd seen everything, until one night, the line between the living and the dead blurred in a way I will never forget. It was a cold and relentless Thursday evening, the type that seems to seep into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. The city was quiet, save for the occasional echo of distant thunder that signaled an approaching storm. I was the only one left in the morgue. The others had gone home early, eager to avoid getting caught in the downpour. The quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the hum of the overhead lights and the faint creak of the aging building. The case I had been assigned that evening was tragic. A young woman, maybe 25, had died in a car accident. She was pregnant, only a few weeks away from her due date. Her husband had rushed her to the hospital hoping for a miracle, but neither she nor the baby had survived. That's what the report said, at least. Her body lay on the stainless steel table in the morgue, draped in a sterile white sheet. She looked almost peaceful, as if she were merely sleeping, but there was something about her I couldn't shake. A peculiar stillness that felt unnatural, even for the dead. I told myself I'd do a preliminary inspection, though protocol dictated the autopsy could wait until the next morning. Something compelled me to check, a gnawing unease I couldn't ignore. It must have been close to midnight when I started. The storm outside had intensified, and the windows rattled with every gust of wind. As I stood over her, preparing my tools, a sound broke through the silence. A faint, almost imperceptible noise. At first, I thought it was the storm, but it grew louder, clearer. A cry, high-pitched, desperate. I froze. The sound was coming from inside the room. My pulse quickened as my eyes darted to every corner, but there was no one else there. And yet, the cry persisted. My stomach turned when I realized it was coming from the woman's body, the cry of a baby. Every rational thought screamed at me that this was impossible. Dead bodies don't make sounds, and babies aren't born post-mortem. But the cry grew louder, more insistent. My hands shook as I pulled back the sheet covering her. What I saw will haunt me forever. There, cradled against her lifeless body, was a baby. Tiny, fragile, and covered in blood, it was still connected to her by the umbilical cord. It flailed weakly, its cries filling the air with a heart-wrenching urgency. I stood frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. She had been declared dead hours ago. How could this be happening? I acted on instinct, grabbing a clean cloth to wipe the baby's face. Its tiny chest heaved as it struggled to breathe, and for a moment its dark eyes opened, locking onto mine. There was something unsettling in that gaze, an awareness far beyond what a newborn should possess. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the crying stopped. The baby fell silent, its chest still, lifeless. Panic set in as I tried everything I could to resuscitate it. My training took over, my hands moving with a practiced precision, but deep down, I knew it was futile. The morgue grew colder, the sterile air heavy with the scent of death. Beads of sweat dripped down my face, even as a chill settled into my bones. And then I heard it, whispers. Soft at first, like distant murmurs, but they grew louder, surrounding me. The voices came from nowhere and everywhere, filling the room with a cacophony of indistinguishable words. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and shift, twisting into shapes that defied explanation. The baby's cry rang out again, piercing and raw, though the tiny body in my arms remained still. I dropped to my knees, overwhelmed by the noise, the shadows, the sheer impossibility of what was happening. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment the room plunged into darkness. When they came back on, the woman's eyes were open. Her glassy gaze met mine, filled with an emotion I couldn't place. Grief, despair, anger, or perhaps all three. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the baby as the whispers grew deafening. The umbilical cord between them began to writhe, as though it were alive, coiling and twisting in ways that defied logic. The shadows in the room thickened, forming grotesque figures that loomed closer with each passing second. Their faces were twisted masks of agony, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was as if the very air around me had solidified, trapping me in place. One of the figures reached out, its skeletal hand pointing at the stretcher where the mother and child lay. I understood in some inexplicable way that they wanted something from me, something I couldn't give. With a surge of desperation, I forced myself to move, breaking free of the invisible hold. I bolted for the door, nearly tripping over my own feet as I fled. The hallway stretched endlessly, the walls seeming to close in with every step. The whispers followed me, growing fainter as I reached the exit. When I finally burst through the doors and into the stormy night, the icy rain hit my face like a slap. I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just experienced. The sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking through the storm clouds. I looked up, searching for some sign that I was still sane, that what I had witnessed was a nightmare born of exhaustion. But deep down, I knew the truth. Some things cannot be explained, and some nights, no matter how hard you try, will never be forgotten. I've always prided myself on being a man of reason, someone who trusted facts over myths. The unknown? To me it was just the undiscovered, waiting to be explained. But that night in the cold, silent room of the city morgue, everything I believed about reality shattered. It was a stormy evening, the kind where thunder growls low and constant, like an animal warning you to stay away. I was the only one left in the building, a last-minute case, they'd said. Unidentified male, mid-30s, found in an abandoned warehouse. The file was scant on details, just a hastily scrawled note. Case 3145, John Doe. The body was delivered an hour before midnight, its arrival punctuated by the hiss of rain on the roof and the distant rumble of thunder. He was a pale man, gaunt, with burn scars spidering across his arms and chest. The burns were recent, jagged and raw, like the flames had licked his skin with a deliberate malice. His belongings consisted of a battered ancient flip phone, the kind you don't see anymore. The phone screen flickered faintly, as if clinging to some residual charge. Curiosity got the better of me. I flipped it open. No saved contacts, just one number listed in the call history, a single outgoing call repeated dozens of times. That detail shouldn't have unnerved me, but it did. I told myself it was the fatigue setting in and turned back to the body. His face was the first thing that struck me. The expression was wrong. Even in death, his features seemed frozen in terror, his mouth slightly parted, as though mid-scream. I'd seen my share of post-mortem grimaces, but this felt alive. I shook off the unease and began my work, the sterile scent of disinfectant mingling with the metallic tang of the storm outside. The first incision was routine, my scalpel gliding through the cold flesh. But as I worked, something changed. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating, and a faint, foul odor began to creep into the room, a mixture of burnt wood and rotting meat. Then I saw it. His heart. It wasn't still. At first I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. I leaned closer, squinting under the harsh fluorescent light. There it was, unmistakable. A faint, irregular twitch. It pulsed weakly, spasmodically, as though clinging to life. My chest tightened. This wasn't possible. I stepped back, my gloved hands trembling. A sudden, sharp ringing shattered the silence. My phone. I fumbled for it, my pulse thundering in my ears. The number on the screen stopped me cold. It was the same number logged in the dead man's call history. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. The ringing persisted, relentless, invasive. Finally, I answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was barely more than a whisper, but it sliced through the line like a blade, words I couldn't fully grasp. Something about repayment, a promise, a return. Each syllable sent an icy prickle crawling up my spine. "Who is this?" I managed to croak. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my reflection distorted in its cracked screen. My hands shook as I set it down, forcing myself to focus. This was just a coincidence, I told myself. A cruel, unsettling coincidence. I turned back to the body, determined to finish the autopsy. Nestled against his left lung was something. It was coiled, black and glossy, like obsidian shaped into a grotesque parasite. I reached for it, my fingers brushing its slick surface. Pain shot through me, sharp and searing, as though my hand had been plunged into ice. I yanked back, biting down a curse. The camera. I needed to document this. I grabbed it, snapping photo after photo with shaking hands. When I reviewed the images, my breath caught. The first photo showed the man, his face still and lifeless. In the second, his eyes were open, staring directly into the lens. By the third, his mouth was stretched wide, unnaturally so, as if screaming silently. The final image made my blood run cold. It wasn't his face anymore. It was mine, warped, hollow-eyed, and frozen in terror. The camera clattered to the floor as I stumbled back, knocking over a tray of instruments. The room seemed to shift around me, the shadows stretching and deepening. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting the room in brief, disorienting bursts of brightness and darkness. I bolted for the door, but when I wrenched it open, the hallway wasn't the same. The sterile white walls were gone, replaced by something grotesque. Faces, dozens of them, pressed into the walls, their features distorted in anguish. Their mouths moved soundlessly, their empty eyes following me as I stepped forward. I couldn't stop. The corridor seemed endless, the air growing heavier with each step. At the far end stood a figure, shrouded in shadow. I didn't need to see his face to know it was him, the man from the table. "Who did I speak to?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't reply. Instead, his face began to disintegrate, the flesh peeling away to reveal a charred skull crawling with writhing black worms. I screamed. The next thing I knew, I was back in the morgue, my hands slick with blood. The body was a ruin, the chest carved with symbols I didn't recognize, the parasite gone. The room felt oppressive, the air thick with an unshakable sense of dread. I left that night, abandoning everything. The report remained unfinished, the case unresolved. I told no one, and no one asked, but it didn't end there. The whispers followed me, growing louder in the silence of my apartment. Shadows moved where there should have been none. And at night, when the phone rings, I know better than to answer. Because whatever I let in that night is still out there, watching, waiting.